Time for a political update video. We have news about stuff happening inside of the Trump administration, the DOJ stuff we talked about a while back. We have a ruling from the Supreme Court on Vanderstock and a few more cases pending. And then locally, we're here in Tennessee, a lot of stuff is happening at the local, state level. So we're going to go over all of that. So this is the Tennessee State House where laws are made, but let's start with the federal news, the stuff that's happening at the national level. So several weeks ago, we did a video talking about some of the things that Donald Trump's administration was doing with the Second Amendment and firearms rights. And to be perfectly honest, it wasn't much. As we pointed out in the video, this is not an area where he's particularly strong. This is not an area where he campaigned very heavily, but he did issue a pretty strongly worded executive order telling his new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, come up with a plan that protects Second Amendment rights. And her actions, since being given that, are, I would say, very clearly a mixed bag. So she missed the deadline and she did not publish a very significant plan to protect Second Amendment rights. And also, in the space of time that we're talking about, we also saw the DOJ handle some of its firearm cases poorly. So the best example of this is probably U.S. versus Peterson, which is a suppressor-based case. And the United States government, the U.S. attorney, made the case that the suppressors are not firearms or related to firearms. They're a separate accessory, so they have zero Second Amendment protections. Now, obviously, firearms enthusiasts, suppressor enthusiasts, and Second Amendment enthusiasts disagreed, and there was a massive amount of pushback, which apparently the White House, the DOJ, Pam Bondi heard about, because we got a couple of things after the the attention. We got a request from Pam Bondi, from the DOJ, to the court to pause on that case while they re-examine their position. Apparently their position is no longer that suppressors are without Second Amendment protections. And that case, they've asked the judge to hold it while they re-examine that position. She has also asked Donald Trump for a 30-day extension to come up with a better plan. So, like I said, it's a mixed bag. We have a very clear indication that something is happening, but we're seeing pros and cons on both sides. Time is still going to have to tell a little bit on this one. The good news is that even though I mentioned we don't have a huge amount of trust in Donald Trump's appreciation for the Second Amendment or Pam Bondi's deep appreciation for firearm rights, this response to public pressure is encouraging, and we can keep that up. Then over on the enforcement side, Kash Patel announced that he is going to reassign 1,000 ATF agents to the FBI, which is very interesting because, well, first of all, the ATF only has about 5,000 employees. So if he's pulling out of that pool, that is a lot of folks. They also have about 2,500 agents. So if he's pulling out of that pool, that's even more significant. However, this is still a mixed bag. I don't know if we actually want to see guys with a ATF track record inside the larger, better funded, and more powerful FBI. Time is kind of going to have to tell on that one. And then on the Supreme Court side, we finally have a ruling on the Vanderstock case, which has to do with frames and receivers and serialization and so forth. And unfortunately, we got a bad ruling on that one. The ATF has kind of gotten their way. Now, the way that the ruling is written, it is specifically about regulations and serial numbers. It doesn't actually give a lot of strong precedent on the rules and regulatory power of the ATF outside of that. And there's some good language inside, but Clarence Thomas, Judge Alito, they did dissent on this ruling and call it a bad ruling. I haven't had a chance to go over the whole thing because it literally dropped this morning. But we also have a few other Second Amendment gun-related cases coming out of the Second Amendment that I'm hoping to see, but I'm a little bit less hopeful about them based on this Vanderstock ruling. But now we get to where most of the action actually is, locally. Right behind me is the Cordell Hull building, where subcommittees and committees are in session. People are talking about gun bills right now. House Crim Sub is ongoing. There's a whole bunch of gun bills. Not all of them got killed last night, so the discussion has been pretty interesting.
And the other people who have died from gun violence, and the other people who have died from suicide, we need to pass better laws.
Representative Pearson.
And fight for a state where everybody is able to live more freely from the pain of gun violence.
Now, I've said for 5 or 6 years that state is really the place where we need to focus our efforts. State law is where we can defend a lot of our freedoms and kind of get the most action for what we put in. And if you've been paying attention, you know that the state level is where a lot of the really hardcore gun control and disarmament stuff is happening. So California comes to mind, New York. This week, Colorado passed a very stringent, essentially semi-automatic weapon ban. So this is where you are going to see a lot of this conflict happen with the federal government. As long as Donald Trump is there, as long as the current Supreme Court is there, they're going to be fighting not so much the Vanderstock ruling, but the much more positive Bruin ruling that was handed down a couple of years ago. The states are going to be fighting at that level with the laws that they currently are trying to pass. Now, you would expect this from California, New York, possibly now you would expect that from Colorado, but not Tennessee. Tennessee is not just a red state. Tennessee is a Republican supermajority. So you might find it interesting that the gun control lobby has registered more gun control lobbyists in this state than at any time in recent memory. And I think that actually kind of makes sense on paper. If you pay attention, you might remember that a couple years ago, our governor, Bill Lee, wanted red flag laws that would allow the disarmament of certain people after a school shooting event. Whether or not the gun lobby sensed like blood in the water or chinks in the armor or something like that, there is a perceived weakness here, and I think that resulted in a lot of attention a couple years ago, and we're still seeing a lot of that attention today. But it's not going to be really hardcore over-the-top disarmament stuff, unless it's a wild performative swing, which is kind of what Representative Pearson was doing just a few moments ago. He was proposing that we repeal permitless carry in the state of Tennessee, which we've had for a few years now. Interestingly, that was passed by Bill Lee, the same governor who wanted the red flag laws. It's been wildly popular with voters, and yeah, there was no chance of that going away anytime soon. That was an attempt to get attention more than an attempt to get actual change.
No, sir. No.
5-minute recess.
But there are a number of bills that I think do have traction in there, and there is a possibility that we will see change with our gun control policies here in the state of Tennessee, and we're having a lot of pushback as we try to get gun freedom bills passed just right over there in that building. Now, this may sound a little bit depressing. You're possibly slightly demoralized. I feel that way myself, but I think it's important that we remember the grander perspective, the bigger picture of what we have accomplished with firearms rights just in the last few decades. If you don't remember, it used to be very hard to get a firearm carry permit anywhere in the states, and now 28 or 29 states have permitless carry, and the Congress is currently debating national reciprocity in the House even as we speak. So this is a very interesting move. And then if you look at just the basic market figures, we are selling more guns now than pretty much at any time in history, except for that very interesting spike in 2020. Even though it's dropped a little bit from that, people are still buying in America over 1 million guns every single month. And there's over 500 million guns in the country. There's an estimate that more than half of the households in America possess a firearm. And the fact that we have to guess at that, we don't have hard data, that in and of itself is still a win. If you look across the gun culture perspective, you can see that education on firearms and interest on firearms and firearms training and firearms accessories is higher than it has ever been before. And in the legal perspective, even though we have some bad rulings from certain judges, other judges are more educated and more thoughtful about firearms and the history of the Second Amendment than any time in the last probably century. I want to call out specifically a guy named Lawrence Van Dyke, who is a judge on the Ninth Circuit, and he is now my favorite gun tuber.
Here's a bunch of grips that I've accumulated over the years. I'm just going to pull a couple out here. This is a nice small grip, a nice small light grip. This is a big heavy grip. All of these grips, under the majority in California's logic, could be banned.
Judge Van Dyke is incredibly well educated on firearms in practice and in principle, and he is a member, like I said, of the Ninth Circuit Court. That is a dissent that he recorded on video so that he could explain to his colleagues why it is that he disagrees with a recent ruling they handed down where they upheld one of California's very egregious full capacity mag bans. And they did so on, well, technically it's exactly the same concept as the DOJ mentioned in the U.S. versus Peterson case. Since firearm magazines are not technically firearms in and of themselves, they have zero Second Amendment protections, and therefore it is fine to ban them in any way, shape, or form. Now, obviously, this is an issue conceptually and logically, and Judge Van Dyke does a fantastic job in explaining this as well as handling his weapons. Now, the interesting thing that we should note about that magazine ban is, once again, we're seeing it happen in California. It is a state law that is being challenged at various levels of the courts. And eventually, it's probably going to make its way to the Supreme Court. It's kind of a game of chicken at this point. Firearm freedom advocates are hoping that it gets to the Supreme Court while there is still stomach and fire and, you know, Clarence Thomas. Then we have a chance of getting a good ruling on these bills. And then the other side is hoping that Clarence Thomas will be out of the picture. We'll get some better judges in there. They'll get some better judges in there. And then the rulings will start to go their way. So that, I believe, is the strategy with some of these cases. But even in the magazine case, it flies in the face of A, what the voters want, B, what the customers of the magazines want, and C, what the statistics even say. So this ban on full capacity or standard capacity magazines has been in place for some time, but there have been weeks of reprieve. So Judge Benitez down in California originally ruled that this was an unconstitutional bill, and for 1 week it was not law. And the people of California bought well over 1 million standard capacity magazines, just like any of their neighboring states could also buy. The number of standard capacity magazines in California went through the roof, and you would expect that if the gun control advocates case was right, and these were an incredibly dangerous thing, they're just going to end up killing a lot of people, you would see a bump in the crime statistics. But you don't. Not only is it unconstitutional, the data doesn't even support removing it as a crime prevention tool. So what we have here is a bill, a ruling, a law that takes away something that helps firearm owners, that is a beneficial part of this really basic human technology, on the grounds that it's going to solve crime, which it technically hasn't done. And when you take the restriction away, crime doesn't get worse. The very facts of the case, the conception of the case, the logic of the case, and the twisting of an understanding of the physical components of a firearm so that it's no longer protected by the Second Amendment, this is kind of silly. And it's the kind of thing that we're seeing in a lot of these different cases here. It's not going to affect crime because it's not going to limit the capabilities of someone who is already hell-bent on breaking other laws besides firearm laws. It is going to get in the way of regular California citizens who just want the accessories that they want for the thing that they want. And now that this protection is taken away from accessories as a concept, Judge Van Dyke points out that any firearm component that isn't serialized could be taken away, and they could be sitting there holding just the fire control group.
So you might ask yourself, well, what part of this pistol would be protected as an arm under the majority's logic? Well, I suppose California would eventually be forced to say, well, this part, the FCU, I guess, is the arm protected by the Second Amendment. Every other part that you added, as I've just shown you, every other part that you added could easily be characterized, just like the magazine, as an accessory that you add to the firearm, and therefore could be banned under the Second Amendment.
So that brings us back to Tennessee. Now, it's very unlikely that a sweeping standard capacity magazine ban would ever pass our group of legislators. But I want to talk about some of the bills that actually are on the docket, some of the things that are actually being discussed inside of that criminal subcommittee meeting right now. One of them adds firearms offenses to the dangerous felony list. These are just enhancements. These are going to be things that catch a lot of criminals, but they are going to be the kind of things that make firearms accidents far more severe, like you accidentally have ammo in your bag when you go through the TSA line or something like that. Little mistakes are a big deal with this bill. And then there's another one, HBO 587, expands racketeering to include firearm felonies. So if you've had some of your firearm mistakes amplified into firearm felonies, well now, because a gun was involved, you're on the hook for racketeering. These are the kind of bills that do squeak through even a Republican supermajority group of representatives, because they're small things that are supposed to go after some of these edge cases, but they end up having big effects. Now, the vast majority of Tennessee voters don't want this, and the vast majority of Tennessee voters own firearms, but even though it's not going to affect the vast majority of Tennessee firearm owners, there are going to be people that get caught up in this dragnet, and their rights are going to be infringed upon, and injustice is going to be done to them. I just heard a story from someone about our ammo tax bill that we did, I think, 6 years ago. It removed a tiny tax from ammunition sales in Tennessee. For most people, this was 10 cents a box. So we were saving them dollars. Not that big a deal. But it actually had a much larger effect than that. There were people who were making tiny mistakes, like the ammo tax sticker falling off of their back box of ammo and having all of that seized. If you were selling ammunition at a gun store or a gun show, you could potentially be losing hundreds or thousands of dollars worth of ammunition being seized by the government and dealing with all of these civil and criminal penalties on top of that. So that tiny tax that saves most people 10 cents removes a huge burden from a number of people and a bunch of injustices that happen. And most of the pro-gun control bills that we're seeing floated here in Tennessee are that kind of death by a thousand cuts thing. They're going to be hurdles. They're going to be obstacles. They're going to be pain points. They feel like very bad faith legislation. They're not trying to address crime. They're not trying to take a moral position. They're not trying to take a strategic position in a longer game. They're just trying to cause pain and difficulty for gun owners. And in some ways, this is a plus and a minus. Obviously, this is so petty and spiteful feeling. But on the other hand, it is kind of all that a lot of the gun control lobby has left. The statistics are no longer in their favor. The rulings are often no longer in their favor. The will of the voter is no longer in their favor. The education around firearms has moved people way over into the pro-firearm side. So a lot of what they have left is lies. The Gifford group actually pointed out the other day that 1 out of every 5 Americans has survived a mass shooting event, which is obviously not true. So there's a lot of lying, but then there's also a lot of underhanded sort of trying to sneak stuff through that will negatively affect pretty much only law-abiding gun owners who make tiny mistakes. And that's where you come in. As usual, I'm going to end this with a little bit of a call to action. It's a very mixed bag of an update. There's all kinds of pros, all kinds of cons. But the big takeaways for me are continue to put pressure on people in the Trump administration, because it appears to be having an effect, at least somewhat. And continue to put pressure locally, because that is where the battle is raging. And your opportunity to get involved, talk to your local representatives, and kill a bad bill that is going to apparently make you a racketeer, that's something that you can actually accomplish. And the benefit of that might be small. It might be preventing 5 or 10 egregious injustices occurring. But those are major deals for the people that actually get caught up in the machinery of the criminal justice system at the federal level or the state level. So get involved. Now, I want to point out that the easiest way to get involved is to connect with some groups that are already doing stuff. So we're here on the Capitol today because this is a day that is specifically organized by Gun Owners of America, the Tennessee Firearms Association, and there's a bunch of other pro-gun groups here. And a bunch of folks have showed up to sit in on some of these committees and subcommittees to talk to their local representatives. So meet your local groups, get connected. GOA and your local state groups are going to be a fantastic place to start. And remember, there's a lot of stuff to do. So we just stepped out to shoot the video that you just watched. While we were out, one of those small bills slipped through. It specifically denies the ability for people to buy a firearm if they've been a recent mental health patient, which sounds very good on the surface, but the way that that is defined and the way that that can be expanded is an issue. I think it may be primarily focused on or primarily impact veterans, people who are seeing psychiatrists for any reason. Now, just because it's out of subcommittee doesn't mean that it's law yet. It still has to make it out of full committee, then it has to be voted on in the House floor. Then the Senate also has to pass this bill. So it's not law yet, but you can see how this stuff sneaks through if you're not paying attention.